was pretty tense, not gonna lie. Grown men yelling at each other with everyone else watching has a certain way of drawing people in, uncertain what will take place next. The cry that echoed out maybe above them all that I heard, my back was turned to the scene, that I heard above them all was simply this: just do what you're supposed to do. The other man had just asked, what is it that you want me to do? The other guy yelled out, veins popping, maybe even a little bit of spit. That's how I imagined it. Like I said, my back was turned. Just do what you're supposed to do. Just a few minutes before that, we're on the tackle football field, and a player went up for an interception, bobbled it just a little bit, caught it, pulled it down, and went running out the sideline. As the other team came running towards him, he deftly stepped out of bounds, was a good 3 feet out of bounds, which you don't have to be a pro football scout to know that once you step out of bounds, you're out of the field of play. That's a safe zone. You can't go forward. Just in case you don't know how football works, I'm here to help you, right? Because people are like, why do we use sports analogies? Because they're fantastic. That's why. And so he's a good 2-3 feet out of bounds, clearly starts to decelerate. And as he does, 2 opposing players come in, helmets down, which is an illegal way to tackle, and slam into him, knocking him off his feet, putting him right on his back. All the stands on that side lean in like, what just happened? The 2 players jump up in celebration at their hit on the player who was out of bounds. Like I said, my back was to them because it was Caden, and he had just gotten his second pick of the game, and as 2 players hit him illegally out of bounds, knocking him on his back, I immediately went down to see how he was doing. The other coach, though, took a much more proactive approach, yelling at the refs that you have to do something. Everybody sees that's illegal. You don't have to have a PhD in football science to know that when somebody's out of bounds, you can't hit them, let alone hit them in that way. It's called targeting. But that cry, the ref looking on, the one with the power, just yelling, would you just do what you're supposed to do? That's what you're here for. Maybe it's not football. I feel some of the same thing when my daughter tells me the story about another school fight. And my longing and my intuition is when she talks about some kid's head getting bounced off a lunch table to be like, all right, so where are the teachers? Isn't somebody supposed to be doing something in this place? Or maybe it's not that. Again, when we come to school shootings, again this week, we lament that these are still things that we process and grieve and have to walk through with our kids. And even if I don't know who's supposed to do what fully, there's a sense inside of us that like somebody's supposed to be doing something, aren't they? It's not even a blame game. Somebody has authority. Shouldn't somebody be doing something? I was talking to another friend who was trying to work through the medical system with her 2 kids this week and working through the injustice of a medical system and trying to figure out the nuances of that. And you're talking to agents on the phone who have all the authority and seemingly none of the knowledge, spending hours and hours on the phone as a parent just trying to give care to your kid. And you're like, what do you want me to do? I want you to do what you're supposed to do. People who serve in the medical field probably feel that even more with the administration of the hospitals. Maybe it's not that, but we look at this season at elected officials, right? And we're like, at the very least, would you just do what you said you would do? Like we voted, and then it's a foregone conclusion that whatever you voted on anyway isn't what they're going to do. But when you see again it happening and unplaying in real time, isn't there something in us that just says, I just wish that you would do what you're supposed to? Government, would you just protect a few people? Would you just provide justice in some pretty clear-cut cases? Would you just look out for the vulnerable in a community? Just do what government's supposed to do. We're engaged in the foster system for the last 3 years as a family, and that process ended with direct, just blatant lies being told about us in closed room meetings where we had no ability to even speak into it. And then when you're asked, all right, so what can I do about this? You're like, you can't do anything. The people with the power already made a decision, and so it doesn't matter if it's true or not. And the ache in our hearts, right, is the family's like, I'm not even as much trouble with the problem with the end result, but the process that's not just. I just wish that those who are tasked with the power would do what they were told to do what they're supposed to do. Parents, don't we feel that sometime when we look across and we see kids being unprotected and we're like, oh my goodness, the role of parents at least is to care and protect your kids. And we see parents putting kids in harm's way. And we say, man, that's not, would you just do the bare minimum of what you're supposed to do and sort out justice in a way that only you can as a parent? Why do I use all those illustrations? Because, and catch this, we often do the same thing with Jesus. And that question that we have is not a new question. Jesus, why don't you just do what you're supposed to do? And not in even a negative way. Like, there's evil in this world. There's destruction. There's harm. All those things I just listed. Can't you do something about that? The cry of our heart as we worked within a foster system to say, like, all right, Jesus, we can't do anything, but you can. And the seeming inaction on his part makes your heart start to question things. And that's not a far off situation from the one that we're going to jump in today in Matthew 13. Picture, if you will, the disciples shouting out, whether quietly in their heart, through their eyes, or with their voices, Jesus, why don't you just do what you said you were going to do? The Romans are still here, and we thought they were going to be put away. We are still under injustice. People are still being abused. There is still inadequacies and insufficiencies and outright abuses in our government. You were supposed to come as the Messiah, the healer, the deliverer, the one who had been promised and set things right. We said we would follow you into this kingdom way of life, and we thought you were going to do that. But you haven't. Why aren't you just doing what you said you would do throughout our whole Old Testament? Each Sunday in September, we're looking at a parable, a story of Jesus. There's many more in Matthew. We're not going to hit them all. But we're taking one a week to look at these kingdom tales where Jesus gives us contours of the kingdom of God. Each story shows a dynamic of this multifaceted thing called the kingdom of God. Shameless plug, Chris Hamilton will be giving a whole night's lecture on this on October 16th in this very room. And so we'll spend 2 hours just digging into the kingdom of God because it is such a beautiful composite of what Jesus is doing in the world. It's the word that he uses to describe what he's up to in the world, what he brought. And so we give little glimpses of it through stories, short teachings on Sundays. And Chris is going to spend an hour and a half or 2 hours, whatever it is, on a Wednesday evening to walk us through this in a different format so we can sit, take notes, and study. It'll be fantastic. Put that in your calendars. But we're looking at these little kingdom stories, what Jesus is setting up for us. And so what we want to do is look at these and then ask, what does this teach us about Jesus and his kingdom, and how can we be faithful to live in light of it? Today's story is the one called the parable of the weeds, which is just great, right? Because you get the parable of the bags of gold last week. This week you get the parable of the weeds. That is plural, in case you're wondering. Don't mess that up. It is not the parable of weed. You'd end up in a very different place. This is the parable of the weeds. It's also, fun fact, one of the parables that we're going to read the parable, and then you're like, man, that's confusing. What does it mean? And like 5 verses later, it says, and this is what the parable means. So we'll read that part as well, because that seems to be appropriate. But would you guys read me? I'll start in verse 24. And Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then he went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, Master, didn't you sow good seed in your field? They're calling him like, didn't you sow good seed? Like, what's this like sketchy seed that's got all this other stuff in it? Like, did you go discount shopping this time? What happened here? Didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where'd the weeds come from then? An enemy did this, he replied. The servants asked him, do you want us to go and pull them up? No, he answered, because while you are pulling up the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds, tie them into bundles to be burned, and then gather the wheat and bring it to my barn. We're going to go down to verse 36, so if you want to drop your eyes down there, you can, but just a few things for us to look at. There's three different features in this story. Each one is going to matter in just a second. The first part of the story is to recognize the sower sowed his good seed, and the crop begins to grow. And at the same time, an enemy comes in and sows some bad seed, and that also grows. We can tell because of where they were in the world and how the words that they use, what the seed was. It was most likely zizania, which is pretty wild. You probably don't know about that because you're not wheat farmers. If you were, you would know that there is, in that part of the world, a plant that grows up very similar to wheat, looks like wheat, has a stalk of wheat, grows among wheat. The only difference is that there's no head of grain that ever forms. And so these weeds look very similar. They grow up alongside of, but never produce the fruit that it's meant to produce. And as such, they are a waste of space, and they take up the nutrients, they take up the soil, they take up everything that you need in order to grow. The water, which is very, very important in that part of the world. They can steal those nutrients, but they grow up, and they're absolutely worthless. And so you would want to get that out of there. It looked just like wheat, but then eventually you came to see, like, that's not wheat at all. That is something completely different. And so the enemy had come in, right, and just sowed that among the midst. Like, let me steal and rob alongside of what this good harvest of this good fruit should be. So that's the first one. The second thing to look at, too, is there's a time between the sowing and the reaping, between the sowing and the harvest, in which not only does the farmer's crop grow, but the enemy's crop also grows. So thing one, there's a planting. That crop of wheat is really there. The enemy came and sowed elsewhere. There's a gap of time in between when both are allowed to grow. And then the third element, just for us to see, is the patience of the farmer and the trust of the servants. So then you're asking, cool, I don't get it. What does it mean? Right, we see seeds being sown, we see good crops, we see bad crops, we see a period of time, and meanwhile, you're supposed to be patient in between while you wait. I don't get it. So Jesus explains this to his disciples, and I'm going to read that over us now, so you can drop down to verse 36. Then he left the crowd and went into a house. His disciples came to him and said, explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. Jesus told two other parables in there, but apparently they got those ones. That one about the weeds in the field still had them kind of scratching their heads. So Jesus answered them, the one who sowed the good seeds is the Son of Man. Language from the book of Daniel speaking about Jesus. The fields is the world, and the good seed stands for the sons of the kingdom, so the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the fiery furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of the Father. He who has ears, let him hear. What Jesus is teaching in this parable, I want us to see as both a warning but also a cause for wonder and worship and obedience. I think there's two main contours, as I looked at this, two main contours of the kingdom that I want us to pay attention to as we read this. The first is that there are two kingdoms. And it might seem simple, but I would hate for us to miss this. That as Jesus tells this story, there are two different kingdoms represented and two orders or ways of looking at the world side by side, both vying with each other. And I think one of the things that he's trying to teach in this text to people as they listen is that it matters a lot that you know the difference between the two types of kingdoms and which one you are in. And I know the warning that goes with that can be heavy, right? We tend to often migrate towards the texts of Jesus that are like, he welcomes in the sinner. He welcomes in the lonely, the lost, the left out, right? He welcomes in those who are lame and gives them the eyesight or their legs back working. And we love those stories, and they are beautiful pictures of the kingdom. And they're important pictures of the kingdom. And they tell us so many needed things about Jesus. It's impossible to see God as an angry, vengeance-dispersing ogre in the sky when you look at Jesus, right? But I think often we can make another mistake, though, and while we reject that characterization of God, we adopt the one that there's never a point where Jesus makes you decide. Like, there's never a point when it really divides. Like, maybe the farmer will just stay really patient until all the weeds turn into wheat, and then he'll finally gather it up. That's not the story Jesus tells. And so as people who live in this world, to recognize that there are two kingdoms at play, it is essential for us. There is a kingdom of light and of darkness if you're in John. There's a kingdom of heaven and a kingdom of the evil one if you're in Matthew. There is a realm where God reigns and rules and his will is done, and there's another one that is ruled by the enemy coming alongside. And the second thing I want us to see, that he's calling for his co-laborers in the midst of those two kingdoms, both being present in the same field, to have patience and trust. He's asking those that co-labor alongside him, right, those servants, because they look out in the world, they look out at the field, and they see evidences. Yes, the wheat or the kingdom of God, like, that's there. It's been planted. It is taking root. It is growing. And yes, at the same time, there is still evil being done, injustice happening. And I think this is where that intersects with that question that we can ask, that I raised at the beginning from a football field or a school cafeteria or a courtroom or in our own hearts. Where it's like, all right, why, Jesus, don't you just do what you said you would do? Why don't you just make it right? Why don't you just deal with the injustice now? Why don't you just stop the abuses or stop the hunger? And while you don't get an answer to the why question, you do get an answer that there is a when question. There is a day coming when Jesus will sort that out. And this is the part where he asks for patience and trust as they co-labor and they work this field along, knowing that there's parts of this field that are producing things that are not in line with the kingdom. They still have to work it. And I think this is so timely for us as we, as MCs and as disciple makers, fill up our everyday lives. Because tell me, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go, and you guys just turn towards each other again. What is, from your last week, you're just going to come up with two things. One thing, an evidence of the kingdom of God taking root that you've seen. And two, what is an evidence of the kingdom of darkness that you have also seen? Right? So this is going to be real for us. We're not just going to be like Kevin's ideas and Kevin's illustrations, as brilliant as they are. Each of us have walked into this week. What's an evidence of the kingdom of God being here that you saw this last week? And or, because if we don't have time for everybody to give both, you can just pick your favorite. Or an evidence of the kingdom of darkness still being here that you saw this week. So I want to speak to one of the more difficult two sentences in the text, and then give us another reminder about why I think this whole story really does matter for us. The difficult part being when you get to the story and you're finding out what it is, it's like, all right, so the person that's sowing, like that makes sense. I could track that. The seed makes sense. We're good there. We're going along, and it's like, oh, there's an enemy, and he planted other stuff. And it's like, I can see that for sure. We get down to around this Matthew 13, verse 40, and it says, as the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. And you can often feel like a feeling to that where it's like, oh, like, what's that about? And then it says, the immediate line after that, right, 41, the Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. We have a really easy time often with the first part of that sentence. Everything that causes sin, where you're like, yes, Jesus, please. Like everything that causes death, decay, destruction, corruption, pollution of God's good creation will be destroyed. I think the fire speaks more to the finality than it does to Dante's Inferno version of hell. And we could talk more about that later, but I think it speaks a lot more to the finality. After a fire has gone through, there is nothing left of that remains. Dante interpreted that to do a whole brilliant work of fiction, but it is a work of fiction, and it's just influenced us a lot. But I'm happy to talk more about that. I don't think it's talking about that they're all thrown into like this hell thing with fire everywhere, and that's what this is talking about. He's talking about an agricultural metaphor where things that you don't use and you don't want to then go out with their seeds throughout your crop, you get rid of finally and fully, right? You don't just throw them in a pile because then the wind would come and scatter their seeds all across your crop again. And so you get away with it finally and fully. But then we were like, okay, that's good. And then he's going to do that to everything that causes evil, that causes sin. And we're like, yes, please do that. We don't want that in the new creation. And then he uses a personal term, though, next, right? And says, everyone. And this is the part where Jesus conflicts with how we want sometimes Jesus to engage with things. But what I would ask us to do as disciples is to entertain the words that Jesus is speaking, that yes, everything that causes that, and everyone who separates themselves from his kingdom way of life by saying they can do it on their own, is forever separated from this vision of restoration. And I'm not asking you to make peace in 3 minutes of Kevin saying that on a Sunday. But I am saying a continuous and regular part of Jesus' discussion about how things sort out in the end is to say that there is absolutely a division of those who bow their knee to King Jesus and are a part of his kingdom community, and those who do not and say, we don't need you, Jesus. We can do it our own way, in our own time, in our own pace, and we can do what we want and still have the same results. Jesus goes, that's just simply not the case. Anyone can respond to the good news of the kingdom. And that's the beauty of the lonely, the lost, the left out, being shown massive amounts of grace. Those who thought they had no place in the household of God being told, you don't just have a place, but sit at the head of the table. Like, that is good news. Anyone can respond to that. But as humans, there's a choice that we make that, yes, I want to respond to that and bow my knee to King Jesus and be a part of his kingdom community, or we say, no, I don't. And this is where the warning comes in heavy. To say no to Jesus and yes to my own thing is to say no to his restored creation and yes to life separated from that. And Jesus wanted his disciples to be just as equipped as he wants us to be equipped to know that matters. If you're not a part of the kingdom of God, like Jesus is saying, if you believe the rest of his words, he's also saying that you will spend eternity separated from him outside of his good reign. And that's why it is important for us to respond to the gospel message. And I know those are hard words. Those are heavy words. And I would be more than happy to grab coffee with you and talk more about those, and I fully mean that. Some of you come from church backgrounds where those words were actually meaning different things at different times. You're like, can we talk more about that? Some of you have never heard that before, and you're like, whoa, can we talk some about all of that? Yet the answer is yes. Talk with your MC leaders. You can talk to me. I'm happy to grab coffee and talk through that. But that imagery, I think, is important for us to get. There are two kingdoms, and our choices with which king we submit to really does matter and has eternal implications. The second part about patience, I think, is also applicable to all of us who say we follow Jesus. To all who say we co-labor with Jesus. We live in this world. It's deeply wounded, but it's also being healed. Don't forget, Jesus actually really did live. He died. He rose again, which means the kingdom is here and has been planted. He did the event that does accomplish salvation in full. We're just waiting in a season for that to finally and fully come all the way to be. But he did the event. The death and the resurrection of Jesus has happened. Listen to these words. I just want to read them over us, and it might be a little bit longer, but I think it speaks directly to us. Jesus says the kingdom is really here. It's really been planted. It's everywhere. You may not be pessimistic about change any longer. You can't decide, that can't happen, I can't change this neighborhood, I can't change this city, I can't change this family, I can't change this life, I have habits, you can't teach this old dog new tricks. The kingdom is here and Jesus is active. The Spirit of the living God is at work right now in this current age. And so we can't say change does not happen because the Spirit of the living God is here bringing new creation every day. Does that mean that it's up to us in isolation to accomplish things and by our own power? No. But we cannot say that change cannot occur. History has been changed by the events that we're reading about in Matthew, which means that your heart can also be changed by the very same words that we're reading in Matthew, the very same power of the kingdom that we're reading in Matthew. It means that your home can also be changed by the very same power we're reading about in Matthew. It means your neighborhood can also experience maybe as slim as blades of wheat popping through, but change and transformation because the kingdom of God is actually here. We don't get to talk anymore as if the kingdom is not here and we're just hoping something good happens. We lean in with hope rooted in events that the kingdom is here. And we participate with Jesus in the work that he's up to. But there is this in-between time between the sowing and the harvesting in which plenty of the old kingdom is still growing. It would be nice if it was like when you spray weeds. I use real chemicals. Some of you probably use vinegar or hot water. Either way, when you spray dish soap on your weeds, that you spray it on the weeds, and then gradually over time, you know the process of death has begun, and within a few days it dies and it withers up, right? Whatever you do. Whatever your range of motion for what you spray on it. And that it would be nice if the kingdom of the enemy was the same way, right? Jesus spritzed it with a little death and resurrection, right? This new creation has come in, and it's got like a shelf life of like 2 days, and then it'll be gone. We look out in the world, and we're like, man, it's still growing. I mean, it has an expiration date. We just don't know when it is, but it appears to still be growing. It's still popping up in new ways, new inventions of evil and new ways of doing harm. But don't forget, the enemy will have counter-revolutions that are fake. He will attack spiritually. The enemy is still using violence and hatred and pride and selfishness. And at times, it can look like the kingdom of God is having setbacks. And this is why it matters that we're rooted in the story and a community who believes it. In the short run, that can seem true. There may be a whole lot of weeds popping through in the garden that you were trying to cultivate in your neighborhood, your home, your heart, the city, the world, the pocket of injustice that you regularly engage with. But hear this. Jesus is saying we don't realize that this isn't going to happen overnight. It will take time, but the kingdom of God is here, and we need to live in light of that. There is going to be still conflict, and we will still have to trust and depend. Those servants in the story had to believe that the farmers, the master, the one who was in control, that he actually had a plan that would work out. Because as they looked at it, I'm sure they just sat back and they're like, man, doesn't seem like it's working that way. Are you sure you're going to get around to this? Are you sure you're going to be able to do this? Isn't that going to be a bigger problem later? But that trust and that obedience to steward what they had been given in the meantime, trusting that he had a plan that would sort it out and it be for their good in the end, was what he was asking of them. And so as the Israelites at that time leaned in and say, aren't you supposed to overthrow the Romans? And he's like, man, the problem of sin is so much bigger than the Romans. Let me deal with it on a holistic scale, and it's going to take a little longer than what you thought, but I am doing it. Some 2,000 years later, we sit here as disciples of Jesus, and the encouragement is the same thing. Remember, there's two kingdoms. But also remember patience in the process and trust that Jesus does know what he's doing. He is alive. He does see you in your hurt, in your pain, in your work. And he absolutely will do justice in the end. And our question comes down to, will we trust him with that? And I think that's where that story is meant to trail off. and stay lingering in our hearts. Would you pray with me?